All right.
All right, here we go.
James 4. Josh, you want to read the first 4 verses for us?
I can.
All right.
So what is causing the quarrels and fights among you? Don't they come from the evil desires that war within you? You want what you don't have, so you scheme and kill to get it. You are jealous of what others have, but you can't get it, so you fight and wage war to take it away from them. Yet you don't have what you want because you don't ask God for it. And even when you do ask, you don't get it because your motives are all wrong. You only want what will give you pleasure. You adulterers. Don't you realize that friendship with the world makes you an enemy of God? And I say it again, if you want to be a friend of the world, you make yourself an enemy of God.
Okay. So let's imagine that we're pre-Bible, first century, and we've assembled for church, and one of our elders gets up with this letter from James, and that is read. Would that be offensive in any way? Or would it be like, hey, that's me? I mean, because you got to, when you read this stuff, we think about it in our context, but when you try to think about it in terms of if I'm in the first century and I show up with my Christian family and this is being read, is that going to be offensive in some way?
But also, it depends. In the first century, they know who these people are.
Well, they know who James is, but he's still pretty much saying,
Calling somebody out.
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, that's like
but you also know he's also who he is. So.
Right.
It's a little bit of both.
Okay. Some of both. All right. Now, this seems to be an expansion of what's already been mentioned in 3:16, where he said, "For wherever there is jealousy and selfish ambition, there you will find disorder and evil of every kind." Because sometimes when we say, what is causing the quarrels and fights among you, where's your mind first go to? Maybe home sometimes. You may have a home where there's never a quarrel, never a disagreement. I don't know. If so, we probably need you up here teaching, okay? But that's not really the context of what he's saying. Who's he writing to? Does he always get the last word, Olivia? Is it the yes, dear?
Oh, him
Here we go. All that.
Here we go.
all over me.
Yes, dear gets you angry?
Oh, yes. Like Olivia saying, look, yes, dear. I'm like, why don't you just tell me to shut up?
That's somebody gave him just that wise advice. And then you probably let it be known that it upset you, and now there you go.
And then he just says it again. And then he had the audacity to tell me Happy Mother's Day, Rumi. So now Benjamin's calling me Rumi.
Say that again. Now I missed that.
Kevin said, Happy Mother's Day, Rumi.
Sorry, that's kind of funny. All right. So James is putting a basic question in front of his audience. Is your aim in life to submit to the will of God? Or another way to say it would be, is your basic aim in life to be loyal to your marriage to Jesus? Or is it to gratify your own desires for the pleasures of the world? Because when you become a Christian, in one sense, you're getting married, right? The church is the bride of Christ. And so when you become a Christian, you are getting married to Jesus. That's the church is his bride. And so he says, this is Barclay, the ultimate choice in life lies between pleasing oneself and pleasing God. And a world in which men's first aim is to please themselves is a world which is a battleground of savagery and division. And really, I mean, if you boil it all down, he's right. We think about, the New Living says quarrels and fights. Barclay translates feuds and fights. Think about feuds and fights in the church setting. What is it people fight about at church? Or do people ever? No. Never. I mean, one of my buddies, and he's a bigger guy. He was in the military. He was built for it, but he actually had to step in and break up a literal fight in the auditorium. I mean, a straight up.
That's pretty cool.
You know, probably not going to be me jumping into something like that because, anyway. But he was built for it. But it happens at church, and really that's probably the main context of the letter. It can happen at home. It can happen at work. Any group setting, anytime you get people together, if somebody's selfish, you have the potential for this to happen. And he says, what is the source? It's the pleasures that wage war within your members. There's something within me, you know, that just won't let me be at peace. Why do we fight or argue about anything? If you have a disagreement at home, at the core, what's it about? I want one thing. And if she wants the same thing, is there going to be an argument or a quarrel? No. So at a core level, it's because I want one thing and somebody else wants something else. And it's a big enough deal that we're actually willing to have an argument or a fight over it. Or sometimes it's just because you know what gets under their skin and you're going to keep saying the same thing until they, just really get mad, right? He says, if pleasure, my desires, is the policy of life, then nothing but strife and hatred and division can possibly follow. Then he quotes Philo. Consider the continual war which prevails among men, even in times of peace. When our country's not at war, are we still sort of at war? All the time. Because there's things that we think we want or things we got to step in and do. So Philo concludes, observe the unspeakable raging storm in men's souls that is excited by the violent rush of the affairs of life, and you may well wonder whether anyone can enjoy tranquility in such a storm and maintain calm amidst the surge of this billowing sea. Here's what it boils down to. And this would help me, and maybe this would help you, but I need to care less about having my own way. At the end of it, when it's all said and done, if I could care less about having my own way, I'd have less problems. And in some ways, I'm probably better than I used to be, but there's still areas where there's a certain way I like things, and I just shouldn't even care as much about having my own way. Ceiling fans drive me crazy. And a lot of it goes back to when I wore contacts. When I'm in a room with a ceiling fan on, it's just sitting there drying my eyes out. Drives me. But even now, when the ceiling fan's on, it's a throwback irritation because it doesn't dry my eyes out now, and I'm not wearing contacts, so it shouldn't bother me at all. But I walk in and it still kind of irritates me, and especially if it's an empty room. A ceiling fan is not cooling the house. It's just moving air. So a ceiling fan in an empty room is doing nothing. If I'm in the room, it moves the air around and it can make me feel cooler. I get that. But you leave it on in an empty room and you're just wasting electricity. So anyway, so I should care less about that because how much electricity does the ceiling fan really use? Very little.
17 cents a day.
Is that what it is? Okay.
Yeah, it goes on the box.
You've got the number. All right.
It's on the box. It's a real letter.
So but if you can quantify it, that's actually a good thing. It's 17 cents worth of fight, but then it's 31 days in the month, and then it's how much is that a year?
$6 a year.
Yeah. I don't know. That's one fancy drink at Starbucks. I don't know. But if I could care less about having my own way, I probably end up in a better place. Now, he says, this is verse 2, you want what you don't have, so you scheme and kill to get it. Was there something beyond murder in the 10 Commandments that would speak against this? You want what you don't have. Thou shalt not what? Covet. Philo points out that the 10 Commandments culminate in the forbidding of covetousness, which is desire. He says, desire is the worst of all passions of the soul. Is that true? Do you agree with that? Maybe he's right. I mean, you need to have some sort of desire about you. You're probably not going to get up and go to work. Desire to eat, desire to have a decent life. I mean, you got to have some sort of desire, but he may be right. It may be one of the worst passions of the soul. He says it's the desire, those evil desires like that destroy relationships. And if you think about that, as a Christian, as a Jesus follower, as it relates to relationships, am I to be in the business of destroying them or building them? We should be relationship builders. And so it actually would go completely in the opposite direction of what we're to be about. Barclay says, obedience to the will of God draws men together. Whereas the will of God that men should love and serve one another, obedience to the craving for pleasure drives men apart, for pleasure drives men to a destructive rivalry and competition and warfare for the same things. There's one pie, and I got to get as much of it as I can. I guess that's what he's talking about. So to obey the will of God is to be essentially selfless. To serve the will of pleasure is to be essentially selfish. So is it selflessness or is it selfishness that's going to be seen in my life? And of course, any two people who are trying to both draw nearer to God are going to also draw nearer to each other. So now the other thing to think about, if we are to be in the relationship building business, when the world looks in our church window and they see this kind of thing going on, what do we look like to the world? Like my buddy's breaking up the fight up there in Michigan in the middle of the auditorium. You're a visitor there that night. First time to ever go to that church. What's your impression? Let's put a
UFC fan.
I was gonna say, let's put a ring in, sell some popcorn, and
I guess it depends on how they handle it afterward.
that could be. That could be. And I don't know what the aftermath was. But we do have to be mindful of what it looks like to the world. One guy in the 17th century, he was a Jewish philosopher. He said, I've often wondered that persons who make the boast of professing the Christian religion, namely love, joy, peace, temperance, and charity to all men, should quarrel with such rancorous animosity and display daily towards one another such bitter hatred, that this, rather than the virtues which they profess, is the readiest criteria of their faith. I'm like, wow. Some things, I guess, haven't changed much. And thankfully, we don't see a lot of that here. I'm thankful that overall we have a sense of love and peace and unity. But, peace has to be maintained. There's something that has to be active with us to maintain anything good that's going on. Another guy said, some battles are, to be sure, worth fighting, but even they must be fought without sacrificing Christian principles and virtues. Chase and I can disagree because some things I may be completely wrong, and he needs to get my attention about that. But when we completely disagree, how do we do that while still maintaining, not sacrificing Christian principles and Christian virtues? And that's a really good point to bring up when we disagree at home as well. The base virtue for every interaction should be what? It's a 4-letter word. Should be love. That should be the base virtue for every interaction. Whether it's we've got to change behavior, we've got to come to agreement, you're calling me out because I'm wrong and I've got to fix it, whatever. Love needs to be the core reason. And if it is, then hopefully we do figure out how to disagree without sacrificing Christian virtues. But, you got to wonder if the people in Michigan in the middle of the auditorium loved each other, right?
I think quarreling and fighting is a sign of our spiritual immaturity.
Okay. May well be.
If you think about a couple points that you made so far, which is caring about what we want less, and the base, I guess, characteristic of every decision we make in love, just those two alone.
Right.
We're if you can do those two on a pretty consistent basis, then you're a pretty mature person, pretty mature Christian.
Right.
So when that breaks down,
Good point.
or if it's not even there.
One of the comparisons, and part of it may be the way we see the church family. I've heard the comparison country club or hospital. One of the other ways I heard it talked about instead of country club was more social club, because there is a social aspect to the church. But, you know, the so many times somehow if I'm in a fight, it's because I feel like my needs haven't been met, or I haven't been respected in some way. I haven't been treated in the way that I thought I ought to be treated. And all of that could be true. But what would the golden rule demand when I haven't been treated the way that I think I ought to be treated? Does that mean I light a stick of dynamite and just see if I can blow the whole thing up? It shouldn't be. And sometimes there's emotion and things like that. But you know, when you think in terms of if this is a hospital, yeah, you probably weren't treated the way you should be, because we all have our issues. We're not all completely healthy. And so, man, we don't want to do that again. So let's see how we can do better. But you try not to blow everything up, because in one sense, we all have our own aspects of not being completely healthy. I like the hospital thought. That one tends to work for me. Kind of changed gears he changes gears a little bit in verse 2 and verse 3. You want what you don't have, so you scheme and kill to get it. You're jealous of what others have, but you can't get it, so you fight and wage war to take it from them. Yet you don't have what you want because you don't ask God for it. And then he says, and even when you ask, you don't get it because your motives are all wrong. You want only what will give you pleasure. We did a whole quarter or more on prayer. And I do believe one of the struggles is sometimes we talk to God, we pour out our heart to God, and the answer doesn't seem to be what we thought it ought to be. And how do you deal with that? Is what James is saying a hard and fast rule? Any prayer that I don't get the answer on that I wanted, it means that I was just asking selfishly? Is that what he's trying to say? I don't think that's what he's trying to say. But how many, in an honest moment, of my requests that go up to God are kind of selfish? You know, that's a question at least worth thinking about. Barclay says the craving for pleasure in the end shuts the door on prayer. The true end of prayer is to say to God and mean, thy will be done. That's hard to do. What is your will, God? Your will be done. He says it's one of the grim facts of life that a selfish man can hardly ever pray aright. We can never pray aright until we remove self from the center of life and put God in the center of life. And maybe that's what Barclay's driving at. It's more about who's in the center of my life. Am I sitting there in the middle trying to make it all about me, or do I have God where God needs to be? And then he gets offensive in verse 4. He calls them what? Adulterers. And if you've got the let's see, I think it's a couple of the translations, like the King James, I think it says adulterers and adulteresses, trying to make sure they understand this is men and women. In the Greek, it's just feminine. In other words, you're married to Christ. If you're married to Christ, this is who you know. It's, I understand what they're doing, but he uses the metaphor there because the church, the members of the church, are the bride of Christ. And he's basically saying, if you fight all the time with each other, you're not honoring your commitment to Christ. And of course, God as the jealous spouse is over and over in Scripture. Isaiah 54, verse 5, for your husband is your maker, whose name is the Lord of hosts, and your Redeemer is the Holy One of Israel, who is called the God of all the earth. Jeremiah 3, verse 20, surely as a woman treacherously departs from her lover, so you have dealt treacherously with me, O house of Israel, declares the Lord. I mean, it's over and over in the Old Testament. And even Jesus in the New Testament, for whoever is ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation. The generation is adulterous in the sense of they don't respect who? They don't respect God. And so he calls them an adulterous and sinful generation. The Son of Man will also be ashamed of him when he comes in the glory of his Father and the holy angels. And so there are several New Testament passages that go down that line as well. And so it's like, if you're married to God, why are you still sleeping with the world? I mean, that's the question he's asking. And if you're fighting, quarreling, selfishly praying, making it all about you, he's basically saying you're still sleeping with the world. Barclay translates part of this, renegades to your vows. Kind of an interesting way of thinking about it. So he says, do you not know? Don't you realize? And when you see that in Scripture, what is he saying? He's saying, you know this. You know, he's not acting like this news to you. I mean, he's just reminding you, this is something you know, but friendship with the world makes you an enemy of God. Is that hard? Do we all like to fit in? I think we do. And sometimes taking the stand for what God wants might make you not fit in as well for some people. And when he says friendship to the world, you may remember we talked about a couple of weeks ago or recently that phrase world in Scripture tends to relate to people who are outside of a relationship with God. Friendship with the world. 2 Timothy 4:10, for Demas, having loved this present world, people, the part of life, folks who don't have a relationship with God, has deserted me. He was worldly. If a man's worldly, he can't be godly. If material things are the things he dedicates his life to, then he can't dedicate his life to God. And you know, this fighting and quarreling that he starts off talking about, what's the source of it? I want something that I don't have. I'm worldly. How important is our stuff to us? How do we like it when somebody tears up our stuff or takes advantage of us and costs us money we didn't think we should have spent? I mean, all these things that just tear us up, it all may come back to something material that we're valuing more highly than we ought to. And I don't like what the Bible does to us, because the Bible's very much black and white on things where we don't like to think that way. No one can serve two masters. For either you'll hate the one and love the other, or be devoted to one and despise the other. You can't serve God and wealth, yet we're wealthy and we're trying to serve God. And who's on the throne? You know, and that's the question we've always got to be asking. And I think we got to ask it a lot, because if we take our eyes off of it, God gets removed, and we don't maybe even intend for it to happen. But
there's nothing wrong with having wealth.
No, not at all.
It's whether you own the stuff or the stuff owns you.
Exactly. I mean, that's the old trite saying that's always said, but it's exactly right. And I think the other part of it is for us, and we actually were talking about this a little bit in the 2 o'clock today, but to go ahead and just come to grips with the fact that we are extremely wealthy. Because we don't like to think that way, do we? Who's
Some
rich?
of us might
Who's
not be wealthy because a lot of stuff is just borrowed money, but we think it's ours.
Well, yeah, but I mean, when you start looking around the world and the number of people that would swap places with any one of us in a heartbeat, because they wonder, I don't know if I'm going to eat today. And we might have a day where we don't eat exactly what we would have preferred to have eaten. And that's usually not even the case. If there's something we want to eat, we generally eat it. And all these people in the world who they don't even know if they're, I think step one is just coming to grips with the fact I am extremely wealthy. And that puts me in a high risk category for not getting this right. Because normally, if we see the word rich, well, I'm not rich. The guy that's got this much more than me, he's rich. I'm not rich. But we just got to go ahead and say, yeah, that's me. God's talking to me. And so I got to keep my eye on that ball and not get off track with it. Y'all may have some other thoughts about it or how we keep it straight. But I do think just admitting to ourselves who we are is a good beginning point, because I don't think it's an admission we like to make. No other thoughts? Any other wisdom?
I think when you think about America being rich, I think being in a church, especially a Church of Christ, most people, we might seem more wealthy, but really America is not quite that wealthy as far as how we manage money. Because was it like, I think 80% could not even, what was it? I think 80%
Well,
can't cover a $400 health emergency
crisis.
fund, and there's several.
It's been watching Abraham.
There's like a different.
Oh, yeah.
There's
Well,
like
you-
a different percentage.
Yeah.
Well, he
You gotta be
preaches.
careful of that,
Him and his daughter, they preach some places. And I like
No,
listening to
yeah.
those sermons, and it's like it's a crazy percentage.
But a lot of times
Their
it's not
car
because
payment is more than their mortgage.
it's not because there's not a what
Like we seem wealthy, but we're really not.
there.
We don't
It's
know
not
what
because
to-
there's
how to
not
manage
a
wealth.
rich level amount of cash flowing through the system. It's because we've taken what's flowing through in a lot of cases, like you said, and we've decided we've got to live at a level, spend this, whatever. Yeah, some of the stories, some of the calls he takes, and you hear people describe it, and you're like, how did you ever get there?
But he did. He himself got himself. He got himself there.
He did, and the funny, not funny, the irony in him, or with his whole, and you drive by that place in Nashville, the building they built, the business they built, but he says, I just give you advice like grandma would give you. I'm not, it's not some magical thing. I'm going to tell you to live like your grandmother would have lived,
It's over a $5 million facility.
500.
500 million?
Yeah, 500 probably.
Yeah, and it's paid in cash. About one loan.
Yeah.
I actually watched the video on TikTok today.
I think I watched the same video. I could have sworn he said 500.
Well, I thought he said 5 million, and he was talking about not having no debt.
What kind of facility is this?
He's got a, I guess he's got.
Well, it's just their,
Like,
it's
you
just
think
their
about
corporate
just the
headquarters.
Property in Nashville there.
I don't know. He was in a
already several
building.
million
He was
dollars.
he was in a building. He was talking about 60-something acres or
That's, yeah, that's not even.
whatever it
that
was.
could
It was
be
huge.
just
It's about
property.
6 acres. I don't remember. Him and Joel Osteen's got something going. But yeah. I don't know.
You're hilarious. He's on a roll.
But I did watch that video today. Like it was.
At least they raised it up.
Yeah.
Um,
Well,
Amen.
A lot of times I really
You
like
gotta
his
buy his
philosophy
book for
too.
$59.99, 3 easy payments. You know.
You don't have to agree with everything he does.
No. and for what he's trying to get people to do, if a family's going to do that, husband and wife had got to be on the same page, or you'll be back to verse 1. What's the source of quarreling and fighting among you? We can't decide how we're going to handle our money. One person wants to get out of debt, and one person wants to live at a certain level, and you've got to decide, I may have to live at a lower level so I can get out of debt, so that later on I can be where I want to be. And so, so your point's well taken. Trying to live beyond means does get some people in trouble. But in most cases, if you just look at the amount of money that's flowing through, there's an amount of money that allows you to live at a level where you're not wondering where you're going to sleep tonight, and you're not wondering what you're going to eat, and you're not having all these worries that people in some of these third world countries have, because they're the money's there. You probably just decided to spend it in a bunch of ways you shouldn't have along the way. So, but your point's well made. We'll pick up in verse 5 next week, and he asked the question, do you think the scriptures have no meaning? That's interesting. We'll pick up there. Any other thoughts on these first 4? It's an interesting
I go back to what you were saying earlier about the rich young ruler, right? And how it says a rich man can't make it through that, like just like a camel can't go through the eye of a needle.
Right.
A rich man can't go to heaven. But then what does he follow up with? With God, all things are possible.
Right, and
that's the whole point of that, is when you are rich, and we are rich, even if you're in debt, you have access to wealth, we're all rich, you can't make it because we're already sinful people,
Right.
even in the choices we make for our stuff.
Yeah.
And I think we try to justify our wealth sometimes, but at the same time, is everybody in here using every dollar you have to help other people?
No.
None of us are. So
No.
there's some sin built in there in all of us.
Right.
In the way we selfishly spend sometimes.
Right.
And that's sin. But how do we overcome that? It's only through Jesus, because it's only through Jesus that's made possible. I think that's the point of the rich young ruler, because we all are the rich young ruler, because we don't want to give up everything. So you can't make it on your own, because he was trying to do it on his own. You can't make it on your own.
Right.
The only way to make it is through Jesus.
Absolutely.
Because we all have sin, and that's built into everyone. That's the way.
Well
I see
stated,
it.
and I'm glad you closed that loop because
If you have any extra, put it in play.
reminder,
But we don't.
we don't,
None of
and
us
we
do.
and we
Not a
need his
single person in here.
we need his grace and mercy because we're all a work in progress. So
Gotta have Jesus.
well said. Well said. All right. Well, I appreciate all the comments, all the discussion tonight. And like I said, we'll pick up with verse 5 for next week.